Ben Mcguire. Ben Mcguire, I met Ben Mcguire on America Online back in 1997. Maybe it was earlier than that, 1990, a little earlier than that. He was part of the original group responding to questions to people that precipitated or that caused Fair Mormon to be created. So in my world, he's been around a long time, and I hope I can count him as a friend. But what's nice about Ben Mcguire is, as people email us on our email list, we have many volunteers who respond to questions, but my feeling is that anytime that Ben responds to a question, I want to take that and put it on the website, because it's always well thought out and really good. So with that short introduction, I'm going to turn the time over to my friend, Ben Mcguire.
Many of our discussions about the translation of the Book of Mormon mention the Nephite interpreters, the seer stone in the hat. We have discussions about whether there was a curtain present during translation. Sometimes we discuss potential anachronisms, like the inclusion of ideas from the New Testament, the use of King James language, or textual reliance on the King James translation. Only very rarely do we find discussions of issues actually significant to translators today. When we speak of translation, we tend to focus more on a description through the eyes of an observer and less on what it means that the text is a translation in the first place. My presentation this morning is about translation, but it is about translation as explained through speech act theory as a communicative act. In introducing translation this way, I hope to build a useful framework both to understand the range of explanations we have built about the translation of the Book of Mormon and to build more constructive answers to the challenges we confront when we look at the text from that perspective of a translation. However, in order to move past some of the earlier explanations and approaches, it is necessary to spend some time dealing with them and eventually to show how these approaches can be reframed by the tools that I bring to the question of translation of the Book of Mormon. In 2003, Glenn Scorgi contributed to a volume on biblical translation from an evangelical perspective. He began by discussing some of the challenges caused by popular evangelical misconceptions. He wrote, "According to the historic evangelical view, divine inspiration is more than a general influence over the biblical authors as a whole. Inspiration extends to the micro level of the very words found in the original text. This is an important doctrine for evangelicals, and it needs to be maintained, but at this point, the reasoning of some, not all, conservative evangelicals begins to shift from defensible doctrine to questionable inference. Each individual word of Scripture, the questionable reasoning suggests, was specifically selected by God and delivered to us from above in a manner very similar to dictation. The words were sent down one at a time like crystal droplets. Each word is an autonomous integer, separate from the rest, and each is to be treasured like a sacred gem and cherished inviolate for all time." Similarly, Mormonism's popular view of the Book of Mormon occupies some of this same space. After all, we have a dictation process. We have revelation that potentially provides not only the specific words used, but is capable of correcting mistakes, at least in the original text. And because of this, we often assume some sort of word-for-word translation has happened with the text. This is not so different from the evangelical perspective described. Scorgi starts with this idea of divine scripture and then extends this to an idea of divine translation. He continues, well, somewhere I have missed a slide. "When it comes to the translation preference and practice, the implications of this way of thinking are predictable. Those who view Scripture this way, and not all evangelicals do, of course, favor attempts at word-for-word translation. Translations produced in this fashion are naively thought to retain all the precious original words, except that they are just in different code now. The inclination is to assume that in every language there is a template of more or less exact equivalence to the inspired Hebrew and Greek words with which we started out. This, of course, is not the case at all. If evangelicals are to get beyond their current impasse over translation theory, they will need a more profound doctrine of biblical inerrancy, one that continues to respect the inspired words of the original text, but also acknowledges that these words are mere instruments in the service of a higher purpose, namely the communication of meaning. Let's see if we can get this to work now. All right, I'm sorry. Our LDS view of the Bible and its translation has changed somewhat over time. In the King Follett Discourse, Joseph noted that the best translation of the New Testament that he had found was an old German translation by Luther. The King James wasn't held in particularly high regard in early Mormonism, but it was the only English text that most readers knew in the 19th century. A second major English translation, the Revised Version, wouldn't be completed until 1885. When it was published, it contained tens of thousands of changes from the King James text, and those changes caused concerns for many believers. It was in this context, and because some of these changes impacted proof texts used by the church, that LDS leadership first came out in strong support for the King James Version of the Bible. This legacy remains with us, as the current statement on the subject from the church reads in part, and sooner or later I will figure out how to get this to work. I think that we're going to go off the slides a little bit because this is not the ones that I have prepared in my notes. All the presidents of the church, this is the statement that the church has published, beginning with the prophet Joseph Smith, has supported the King James Version by encouraging its use in the church. In light of the above, it is the English language Bible used by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is a bit misleading since Joseph Smith, with the rest of the early LDS leadership, supported the use of the King James text out of necessity and not necessarily out of choice. My concern, though, isn't simply the adoption of the King James translation, but rather the adoption of much of what was being said about the King James and its translation by non-LDS contemporaries. These are the kinds of ideas introduced by Scorgi and the kinds of ideas that remain with us today, both in our view of biblical translation and in our view of Book of Mormon translation. Stephen Ricks, in a short note in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, confronted the same sorts of challenges that Scorgi addressed when he discussed David Whitmer's description of the translation of the Book of Mormon. He wrote, "This statement is somewhat problematical from a linguistic point of view. It suggests a simple one-for-one equivalency of words in the original language of the Book of Mormon and in English. This is scarcely likely in two closely related modern languages, much less in an ancient and modern language from two different language families. An examination of any page of an interlinear text, a text with a source language such as Greek, Latin, or Hebrew, with a translation into a target language such as English below the line, will reveal a multitude of divergences from a word-for-word translation. Some of the words are left untranslated, some are translated with more than one word, and often the order of words in the source language does not parallel, sometimes not even closely, the word order of the target language. A word-for-word rendering, as David Whitmer's statement seems to imply, would have resulted in syntactic and semantic puree." We could extend this even further. If we follow what the text of the Book of Mormon seems to suggest, then the Isaiah passages that Nephi quotes come from an Egyptian text, which was translated from a Hebrew original. That Egyptian text is then translated into the language on the gold plates, which is then translated into English in the Book of Mormon into a nearly exact copy of the King James. Is this really very likely? Whitmer's statement was published in 1887. In my opinion, it is not coincidental that this statement and the others discussed by Ricks all came shortly before and shortly after the publication of that next major English translation. They are, I think, not just a part of our LDS discussion about the translation of the Book of Mormon, they participate in that larger discussion on the question of biblical translation more generally and the nature of divine scripture. In contrast to Ricks, Royal Skousen took a very different approach to these statements in his 1998 essay titled, "How Joseph Smith Translated the Book of Mormon, Evidence from the Original Manuscript." He wrote, "The manuscripts and text show that Joseph Smith apparently received the translation word for word and letter for letter in what is known as tight control." And it would be a little more obvious if I had all my slides here, but part of the difference was more about not how it was received, but whether it was this loose or tight translation model that we'll talk about in a little bit. These two competing views highlight some of our core interest. Is the translation human? Is it divine? In fact, if you look here now, this is the David Whitmer statement. And can the text and manuscript really tell us much at all about the process of translation? The focus for earlier discussions on the Book of Mormon have focused on the text that we have, but this text comes as a product of whatever process of translation occurs. Historically, part of our struggle with the question of translation comes from the comparisons we make between the text of the Bible and the text of the Book of Mormon. We can see this in the subtitle of the current edition of the Book of Mormon, in the phrase, "Another Testament of Jesus Christ," which explicitly invites such a comparison. And we find all sorts of other markers for that comparison, whether it is the visual cue of versification added in the 1879 edition, or the image of the Book of Mormon as the stick of Joseph from Ezekiel's vision, introduced to the saints in the writings of William Phelps in 1833. Most of the time, this comparison works well and helps those we introduce to the Book of Mormon understand how we use and understand the Book of Mormon within our faith. But when we take this comparison and extend it into studies of the text, it can create some very real problems. Our tendency to try and understand the Book of Mormon and its translation primarily through the lens of biblical studies and the tools employed within traditional biblical studies is part of our present inadequate framework. I will argue that the text of the Book of Mormon, even the various manuscript copies, is the end result of this process of translation and really cannot answer many of the questions we ask of it. We also have to consider the various other forces at work, and these forces can be identified through speech-act theory. Perhaps we could just go ahead and shut this off because it's not going to line up. Who was that? Okay. Well, it's not that. It's that the presentation that's on there has a different set of slides than the ones I was hoping to get. How does Joseph Smith describe the translation process? We'll see if we can bump ahead. Here we go. At the end of June in 1829, the three witnesses were allowed to see the gold plates. In the statement that they signed, it tells us of the translation process that the Book of Mormon is a record of the forefathers of our western tribes of Indians having been found through the ministration of an holy angel and translated into our own language by the gift and power of God. At some point in August of 1829, Joseph Smith, with perhaps the assistance of Oliver Cowdery, wrote the preface to the first edition of the Book of Mormon. In it we have this statement: "I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God and caused to be written 116 pages, the which I took from the Book of Lehi." And on November 9th in 1829, Oliver Cowdery wrote in a letter to Cornelius Blatchley on behalf of Martin Harris, and he, by a gift from God, has translated it into our language. On occasion, we also see references to the 1833 letter from Joseph to Noah Saxton and other early comments. These continue to use the language published in the published testimony of the three witnesses. We all recognize that this language leaves something to be desired. Joseph Smith did not seem interested in explaining in any greater detail, and perhaps some of you are familiar with the statement that he made to Hiram in a church conference in 1831. It was not intended to tell the world the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, and it was not expedient for him to relate these things. Where does this language about translation come from? It is taken from Omni, verse 20. "And it came to pass in the days of Mosiah, there was a large stone brought unto him with engravings on it, and he did interpret the engravings by the gift and power of God." When Joseph and those with him first articulate this formula, it comes right after the translation of this verse in Omni. Joseph employs this phrase as an allusion to the text of the Book of Mormon. That is, Joseph isn't just interested in saying that there was a divine component to the translation process. He very much wants us to understand that he was functioning as a seer, just like King Mosiah, that his use of the interpreters was just like that use made in the Book of Mormon with reference to the Jaredite record, and so on. And since we rarely connect these two in this way, the importance of the allusion to Joseph's intention is often lost. Why are these statements rather an unsatisfying description of the process? They are not employed to describe the translation process at all. At the same time, we sometimes tend to take a very literalist understanding of Joseph's statement here. In a recent essay, Stanford Carmack works to maintain this idea of Joseph as a translator even while minimizing his role in the process. He wrote, "It is still appropriate to call Joseph Smith the translator of the Book of Mormon, but he wasn't a translator in the usual sense of the term. He was a translator in the sense of being the human involved in transferring or retransmitting a concrete form of expression, mostly English words received from the Lord." When I first read this, I was reminded of a comment written by Oliver Cowdery dealing with one of the earliest criticisms of the Book of Mormon over the identification of Joseph Smith as the author of the Book of Mormon in the copyright statement. This statement was required by contemporary copyright legislation, but in making a formal response, Oliver quoted Webster's 1828 dictionary. He wrote, "Your first inquiry was whether it was proper to say that Joseph Smith Jr. was the author. If I rightly understand the meaning of the word author, it is the first beginner or mover of anything or a writer." So these are the definitions from the Webster's dictionary that he's quoting. Now, Joseph Smith Jr. certainly was the writer of the book, of the work called the Book of Mormon, which was written in ancient Egyptian characters, which was a dead record to us until translated, and he, by a gift from God, has translated it into our language. Certainly, he was the writer of it and could no less be the author. Oliver suggests that while Joseph wasn't the author in the usual sense of the term, he could nevertheless be called the author. While these sorts of statements may be helpful in both circumstances, as somewhat of an apologetic argument, it isn't very helpful in understanding what is going on in either case. The final complication I want to mention is the question of authenticity. Most often our analysis of translation and translation-related issues isn't meant to describe the process of translation itself, but to try and move that process into the realm of proof of authenticity. In the statement above, Carmack suggests that we should view Joseph as a translator in name only, and he goes on to suggest that Joseph couldn't possibly have translated the text, and this becomes proof of authenticity. I think it makes for a strange proof of authenticity when we talk of a translation by arguing that we have no idea who the translator was or how they did their job. Another example of how we conflate translation with proof comes in assumptions surrounding chiasmus. This is one of many examples I could bring up, but it's one I'm familiar with. Earlier, I noted that we have a tendency to use the tools of biblical criticism to investigate the text of the Book of Mormon. When we apply these tools to the Book of Mormon and get results that are similar to the results produced in biblical studies, we use these results to suggest authenticity, to suggest proof. I see this regularly in essays, both published and unpublished, exploring aspects of chiasmus. A relatively recent favorite for a chiasmus enthusiast was the 2010 essay by Edwards and Edwards titled, "Does Chiasmus Appear in the Book of Mormon by Chance?" This study is fascinating. It provides what could turn out to be a very valuable negative check to the use of proposed examples of chiasmus in a text, but it also has some real issues related to its purpose. In the conclusions, they note this: using chiasmus to strengthen the claim of authenticity of the Book of Mormon as an ancient historical record is based on the assumption that Joseph Smith was unaware of chiasmus. And this seems to be par for the course when we engage this topic. Biblical studies is by definition quite narrow. They have very little interest in or need for interest in chiasmus outside of their field of study. And so Edwards and Edwards wrote in their introduction that the historical record has yielded no direct evidence that Joseph actually knew about chiasmus when he translated the Book of Mormon in 1829, although some other people at the time did. The study uses a footnote to point to a series of articles by Jack Welch, Don Perry, and Dan Peterson, and those articles are certainly worth reading. And of course, if we look for references to chiasmus contemporary to Joseph Smith, we are going to come up with a very short list, as these authors all do. In fact, the term chiasmus is really rather quite late, and in terms of biblical studies, this isn't much of an issue. But in modern literary studies, we find the same concept under the label of ring forms and ring structures. And we can find entire books written with a chiastic structure that are roughly contemporary with the publication of the Book of Mormon. The one that first caught my attention and introduced me to this concept was published by Giambattista Vico in 1710, titled Liber Metaphysicus. This, by the way, the the picture is the title page of an article that digs into some of the discussions about Vico's work. Just as significant was the influence Vico had on Wagner, his ring forms becoming the structure of Wagner's The Ring of Nibelung, his epic four-part music drama composition. And Wagner's work went on to inspire James Joyce, most notably in his novel Ulysses. Of course, in the context of ring forms, especially canonical ring forms, the inclusions, I just did something wrong. The inclusion of these structures happens at the time of authorship. They are part of compositional frameworks and not so much involved in the actual rhetoric of a piece, except indirectly, of course, as the patterns once recognized can help us understand how the author relates various topics to one another. Macrochiasmus, including those found in the Book of Mormon, suffer from the same kinds of issues. There is little doubt that the reason why long chiastic structures in the Book of Mormon are often difficult to notice is precisely that they are long enough that by the time we reach the end, the beginning is a distant memory. And the suggestion that the center is the most important idea is something of a circular reasoning created by our notion that the center should be the most important part. Bill Benson provides something different for us in this example, and I'm not going to read it. Bill explains, that's a canonical ring form. While the departure from and arrival back home being first and last elements in the ring, and the purchase of the bottom milk being the midpoint, the events in the tale are arrayed symmetrically about that midpoint. And within canonical ring forms, the center isn't necessarily the main point, it simply serves as the middle of the structure. My point here isn't to contest the idea of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. There seem to be some remarkable structures in the text. What I'm suggesting is that the appearance of modern chiasmus, and in particular of these macrochiastic structures, along with a body of literature describing them and their use, point to an unrecognized problem. Biblical studies has no interest in modern literature, so has never engaged the question of chiasmus as an established structure and form apart from its narrow interest in the ancient Near East. And because this literature exists outside of the world of biblical studies, most Mormons engaged in these studies are simply oblivious to its existence. Chiasmus as a literary structure wasn't as unknown in Joseph's day as we sometimes like to believe. It just wasn't always called chiasmus. This doesn't mean that Joseph Smith had ever read Gian Battista Vico, or, if we follow the tortured logic of certain critics, that he had ever heard about his writings from someone who could read Italian and had a copy. What this illustrates for me is that these proposals about chiasmus in the Book of Mormon are often far more interested in trying to create an argument for authenticity than they are in trying to understand the text. These kinds of approaches, using the tools of biblical studies, tend to blur the distinction between the Book of Mormon as a modern text and its potential ancient sources. To help rebuild the distinction, I am proposing the following framework for discussing the translation of the Book of Mormon as a communicative act. As I introduce this framework, I'm going to use it to analyze models of dictation proposed by Royal Skousen in 1998. Skousen described what he identifies as three kinds of potential controls over the dictation of the text. And I'm going to hope that I have a couple of these slides in here. First, loose control, where ideas were revealed to Joseph Smith as he put those ideas into his own language, a theory advocated, he writes, by many Book of Mormon scholars over the years. Tight control, where Joseph saw specific words written out in English and offered them to the scribe, the accuracy of the resulting text depending on the carefulness of Joseph and his scribe. And ironclad control, Joseph or the interpreters themselves would not allow any scribal error to remain, including the misspellings of common words. For my purposes today, there is very little difference between the notion of tight control and ironclad control. I will consider them as essentially the same process. I will start by identifying the participant roles in the communicative act. For those of you who are unfamiliar with speech act theory, this theory deals with communicative acts, not just what we say, but what we do by saying it. When I first became interested in the theory, I was exploring the idea with an interest related to my day job in technology. What fascinated me were spam emails generated by algorithm with the intention of sneaking through a spam filter with some sort of payload, a virus, a phishing link, an offer to become a business partner with some former notable figure in Nigeria. These algorithms attempted to simulate real emails to try and fool the spam detection algorithms. Of course, technology changes have to some extent changed the problem quite a bit in the last decade, but at the time there was something of a race between these spammers to build more sophisticated algorithms faking normal emails and the spam filters trying to detect them. The emails were often intelligible. They could be read, interpreted, but they didn't actually have an author. And while they conceivably had a purpose and perhaps an intention, that purpose and intent had nothing at all to do with the actual words in the message. The words were used much more as an aesthetic arrangement rather than some sort of communicative act, a forged piece of artwork passing itself off as a masterpiece. The well-known sociologist Erving Goffman really gave speech act theory its foundation. When Goffman tackles the notion of a speaker, he describes for us the complexity of the idea. In canonical talk, one of the two participants moves his lips up and down to the accompaniment of his own facial and sometimes bodily gesticulations. Goffman, by the way, liked to add a little humor sometimes to his writing. And words can be heard issuing from the locus of his mouth. His is the sounding box in use, albeit in some actual cases he can share this physical function with a loudspeaker system or a telephone. In short, he is the talking machine, a body engaged in acoustic activity, or if you will, an individual actor in the role of utterance production. He is functioning as an animator. Animators and recipients are part of the same level and mode of analysis. Two terms cut from the same cloth, not social roles in the full sense, so much as functional nodes in a communication system. And he continues, but of course, when one uses the term speaker, one very often beclouds the issue, having additional things in mind, this being one reason why animator cannot comfortably be termed a social role, merely an analytical one. Sometimes one has in mind that there is an author of the words that are heard. That is, and now it jumps ahead a bunch. Let's just go back. If you can go back to the first of the two cartoon strips, they'll find that amusing. No, one more. Sometimes one has in mind there's an author of the words that are heard. That is someone who has selected the sentiments which are being expressed and the words in which they are encoded. And sometimes one has in mind that a principle in the legalistic sense is involved. That is someone whose position is established by the words that are spoken, someone whose beliefs have been told, someone who is committed to what the words say. Goffman divides the notion of a speaker into three distinct functions, and these functions are useful in creating descriptive structure for communicative acts. Several years later, James Macaulay, you can move it ahead one, Macaulay formulated what has become a classical description of how these roles unfold. In his example, President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to deliver a speech. He explained what he needed to his speechwriter, who then produced his speech, but due to a scheduling conflict, the president could not deliver it, and so sent then Attorney General Meese to deliver it in his place. In this context, Reagan was the principal, his speechwriter was the author, and Meese became the animator. This example illustrates that these three functions can be combined in many ways to create often very elaborate structures. Standing on the other side of the communicative act is the audience, the reader, the hearer or the reader. And of course, we could come up with a very complicated set of potential listeners as well. We function quite differently as listeners when we are eavesdropping on a conversation while waiting in line for movie tickets, or when we are sitting watching stand-up comedy, or attending a political rally, or sitting in the pews in church on Sunday. I'm not going to engage this piece in great detail because when we deal with text, we are concerned with very specific sorts of issues about audiences, and I have detailed some of my perspective in my last essay, An Interpreter, Nephi, a postmodernist reading. In particular, though, it is important for us to understand that in the absence of a real audience, when we write to an imagined audience, an idealized audience which may or may not reflect very closely the real audience that actually reads what we write. My interest in bringing this notion of this discussion becomes apparent when we look at translation as a communicative act. And generally speaking, translation is not one communicative act, but two. Göran Sonesson tells us that there is something fairly obvious about translation being a double act of communication. He writes, being at the end of the receiving end, I want to read the new novel by Mo Yan, but I am unable to read Chinese. Therefore, somebody must have read the novel before me, and this must have been a person who can understand Chinese. It must also be a person who can write my language. This person then is at the receiving end of one process of communication, but at the start of another process. What makes this model more useful for understanding translation than earlier models, however, is the ideas about communication as such, which I've presented above, that the receiver is an active subject who must concretize the artifact produced by the receiver into a percept. The translator is a doubly active agent, subject as interpreter and as creator of a new text. He or she is a receiver of one active communication, the sender of another one. He or she first has to transform the artifact into an object of his or her own experience. This is a process that cannot be described as encoding with any intentional depth of the word, because this term suggests a simple exchange of one coded item for another. The correspondence often has to be at a much higher level of understanding. To put it in less technical terms, in the first communication act, the translator functions as part of an audience. In the second act, the translator participates normally as both animator and author, as functions within that speaker role. When we apply these roles to Skousen's model, if you want to go ahead and move the slide forward, the first thing to recognize is that Joseph Smith never read the gold plates directly. He didn't learn the language on them. Joseph Smith is not the person described by Göran Sonesson. Skousen writes that in the model for loose control, ideas were revealed to Joseph Smith. This is a second communicative act. If we can move it forward. The first was the writing on the gold plates. In this second communicative act, Joseph Smith is the audience. These ideas are a communicative act that Joseph Smith can understand. But in this model, the three functions of the speaker aren't given to us. We can assume the principle remains the same as it was for the gold plates. That is, the ideas in translation are still representative of the original authors of the gold plates. Skousen then suggests that Joseph put those ideas into his own language, and this becomes the third act of communication. And in this act, Joseph has to interpret these ideas and put them into his own language. So in the loose model, Joseph Smith functions as both author and animator in the final communicative act. And Joseph shares that role of animator, of course, with his scribes, and if we are concerned with the published version of the text of the Book of Mormon, eventually with the copyists and the printer. In the tight model, Skousen tells us that Joseph saw specific words written out in English and read them off to the scribe. Joseph merely repeated what he saw or read. There is no third communicative act described here. Go ahead and move it again. We have a principle, just as we did with the loose model, and we do not know who the author is. That author produced the English words that Joseph read, and so is also the animator of the text, but in this case he shares that role of animator with Joseph Smith, with the scribes, and with the copyists and the printer. Earlier, I quoted Goffman, who explained that animator and recipient are part of the same level and mode of analysis. I'm going to repeat a little bit, there is no third act of communication if Joseph has no interpretive involvement and does not transform that second communicative act into his own experience. Joseph simply does not translate here. And because there is no third act of communication, when we deal with questions of scribal changes or changes in the copied text prepared for the printer or changes made during the printing process, what we're really doing is describing the transmission of the text and not some sort of translation or even evidence for translation. These kinds of issues cannot provide us with any information about the translation or the translator. This does bring me back to the idea we often favor the kinds of tools used in biblical studies, and those studies have a lot of interest in these sorts of issues in transmission, orthographic variants, errors in various sorts, emendations, and so on, because they are helpful in moving towards an original text. And of course, when we engage these issues, these tools are profoundly helpful, and they can help us move towards the original text. But that text remains the text that Joseph read and shouldn't be confused with the original writing on the gold plates, or in this tight model of translation, even with the original manuscript prepared by Joseph Smith and his scribes. That original text is the words that Joseph read. Oops, can you back it up one? In several of these communicative acts, the best defined role is that of audience. And yet the audience is often the most frequently ignored role in our current discussions of translation for the Book of Mormon. We can look around ourselves at a conference like this and see the very real audience that actually reads the Book of Mormon. But what was the theoretical audience to whom the book was written by the translator in the last communicative act? Audiences play a significant role in the way in which texts are written, including translations. Perhaps the simplest and potentially most profound way in which this plays out is in the language itself. This is especially true in a translation where the objective is to create a text that can be read by the audiences out of a text that cannot. With the Book of Mormon, this language is English. But what do we make of this English? I will come back to this question in a couple of minutes because it is a part of the dialogue that we currently see in Book of Mormon studies. The influence of the intended audience doesn't stop with language. It covers syntax and grammar, it covers imagery and rhetorical figures. Lawrence Venuti wrote that a translated text, whether prose or poetry, fiction or nonfiction, is judged acceptable by most publishers, reviewers, and readers when it reads fluently, when the absence of any linguistic or stylistic peculiarities makes it seem transparent, giving the appearance that it reflects the foreign writer's personality or intention or the essential meaning of the foreign text. The appearance, in other words, that the translation is not in fact a translation, but the original. The illusion of transparency is an effect of fluent discourse, of the translator's effort to ensure easy readability by adhering to current usage, maintaining continuous syntax, fixing a precise meaning. What is so remarkable here is that this illusory effect conceals the numerous conditions under which the translation is made, starting with the translator's crucial intervention in the foreign text. The more fluent the translation, the more invisible the translator, and presumably the more visible the writer or meaning of the foreign text. But good translation goes even further than this. Eva Hung tells us that many of the translation activities which led to the new developments and changes in Chinese culture were initiated or undertaken by non-Chinese people. For their work to be effective, they had to have sufficient knowledge of China's contemporary needs to be able to properly place both themselves and their work within the host culture. Good translations don't just re-encode language, they transform it. And this was noted quite early. Alexander Tytler wrote in 1791 that the translator ought to always figure to himself in what manner the original author would have expressed himself if he had written in the language of the translation. Or in other words, a good translator will write a text so that it would be exactly the same as what the original author would have written had that been his native language and his native experience. When we translate too closely, too literally, Venuti tells us that we risk obscure diction, awkward construction, and hybrid forms engaging in translationese, a word defined in the OED as the style of language supposed to be characteristic of bad translations, unidiomatic language in a translation. This audience-driven view of translation produces some interesting issues when we approach the Book of Mormon. Why? Because by our standards, and even by the standards of that first audience in 1830, the Book of Mormon does not seem to be very fluent. Venuti, referring to a number of reviews of translation that he uses to illustrate what is meant by fluency in a translation, tells us that a fluent translation is written in English that is current instead of archaic, that is widely used instead of specialized, and that is standard instead of colloquial. Foreign words are avoided, as are Britishisms in American translations and Americanisms in British translations. Fluency also depends on syntax that is not so faithful to the foreign text as to be not quite idiomatic, that unfolds continuously and easily, not doughy, to ensure semantic precision with some rhythmic definition and a sense of closure, but not a dull thud. A fluent translation is immediately recognizable and intelligible, familiarized, domesticated, not disconcertingly foreign, capable of giving the reader unobstructed access to great thoughts, to what is present in the original. Our two dictation models will approach this issue in very different ways. In his tight model, Carmack suggests that early modern English is used because this was the language of the translator. And he was doing exactly what Venuti suggests, providing us with a fluent translation of the gold plates. In a recent essay in Interpreter, Carmack suggests the linguistic fingerprint of the Book of Mormon in hundreds of different ways is early modern English. Smith himself, out of a presumed idiosyncratic quasi-biblical style, would not have translated and could not have translated the text into the form of the earliest text. Had his own language often found its way into the wording of the earliest text, its form would be very different from what we encounter. This also suggests a very real gap between the idealized audience of the translator and the very real first audience who read it. And this is a conclusion that Carmack embraces, as he notes at the end of that essay. A large amount of textual evidence in the foregoing discussion contains only a sliver of it. Tells us that Joseph Smith did receive and read a revealed early modern English text. Understandably, he may not have been fully aware of it. At the risk of taking some liberties, this is something like suggesting that while the translation was quite fluent, it simply could not be helped that this translation would not be read for a significant period of time, and that its first readers would not appreciate the fluency of the text because they no longer resembled the audience envisioned by the translator. By contrast, the loose model suggests that the final translator, Joseph Smith, is preparing a translation for a contemporary audience, and that it simply isn't a fluent translation. Carmack again argues against this notion, suggesting that the lack of fluency is simply a presumed idiosyncratic quasi-biblical style that the translator was imitating Scripture. From another perspective, Gideon Turry, a non-LDS scholar of translation theory, suggested back in 2005 that the Book of Mormon was presented as a translation because it had greater ability to create cultural change. As he noted, as has been demonstrated so many times, translations which deviate from sanctioned patterns, which many of them certainly do, are often tolerated by a culture to a much higher extent than equally deviant original compositions. In other words, had Joseph Smith been the translator, and had he prepared a completely fluent translation, it would have seemed far more likely to his intended audience that it was an original work and not ancient scripture. I should note that Turry's study, which relies exclusively on Fawn Brodie for biographical details about Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon, does in fact assume that it was an original work. The point, though, is that it is also quite possible to see the Book of Mormon's lack of fluent style as a deliberate part of creating the modern text of the Book of Mormon as a communicative act. In contrast to Carmack's view, this approach suggests that the archaic language isn't intended to convey a text written in early modern English, but rather that it intended to incorporate what might be labeled translationese. Part of its impact is created when we understand the text as a translation of an ancient work, and so this becomes part of the rhetorical strategy of the text in translation. The fluency that Venuti values has been given up to an extent to keep the text from sounding too original and to help its audience identify the text as Scripture. I want to point out something which I think should be obvious here. This deliberate use of archaic language can be understood in many different ways, and it can be understood both in the context of a tight and loose model of dictation, and it can be understood with a wide range of potential translators. What this framework does is help us articulate what role in our communicative act is responsible for the features that we see in the text. You want to move ahead to my last heading there? Not too long ago, I published an essay in Interpreter that spent some time exploring Nephi's ideas of likening Scripture unto himself and the way in which he reinterpreted Isaiah to fit the current context of his people and the society they were trying to build in the New World. This was a translation very much in the modern sense that I've been discussing this morning. And Nephi is quite clear about what he is doing. He tells us, the readers, that his people have a hard time with Isaiah because they do not understand its historical context, and that one way to fix this issue is deliberately removed from the equation. 2 Nephi 25:2, he tells us, "For I, Nephi, have not taught them many things concerning the manner of the Jews." In this neat way, Nephi remakes these scriptural texts into something relevant for his people, and often in ways that ignored the original context and intentions of their original authors. This provides for us a way to understand the Book of Mormon as a modern translation. As a modern text, the first readers of the Book of Mormon not only had not been taught about the Nephites, their only real source of information about them was in the text itself. And it should not come to us as a surprise to find materials in the Book of Mormon that have been recontextualized for its intended audience, the modern audience that actually reads it. When we find this information in the text, it tends to create something of a gap between the reality we see and our expectations drawn from our attempts to make the Book of Mormon as much like the Bible as possible. Some of you might be aware of the response to David Baccaboy's suggestion that the Book of Mormon could be considered, at least in part, pseudepigraphical. This isn't an unreasonable conclusion if we adopt the toolkit of biblical studies as our primary approach and we conflate the text, the modern text of the Book of Mormon, with its ancient sources. In a sense, it is perhaps similar to the conclusions we might see from biblical studies if they only used the text of the King James Bible and had no access to archaeological information or original language sources. When we approach the text of the Book of Mormon, our studies need to be cognizant of the Book of Mormon as a modern text and as a text that has been recontextualized for a modern audience. A text whose author was potentially aware of the interpretation that would be given to the text and the implications of those interpretations on issues contemporary with its first readers. Should we be surprised to sometimes find our own questions reflected back at us from its pages? When we look for chiasmus, we have to ask how chiasmus will filter through the potential translation layers we envision. When we see places where the text engages New Testament ideas and values, is this potentially the way the translator understood the text in the modern context? Is this the way the translator believed the original author would have expressed himself if he had written in English and in a modern time frame? And when we see the text that is nearly identical to the King James, perhaps it is there as a way of helping its first readers identify the biblical passages being referred to, instead of suggesting that they are a completely literal translation from the gold plates that just happened to validate the King James as the best translation ever. Brigham Young, in a sermon delivered in 1862, seemed to recognize a fluidity in context. He said, "When God speaks to the people, he does it in a manner to suit their circumstances and capacities. Should the Lord Almighty send an angel to rewrite the Bible, it would in many places be different from what it is now. And I will even venture to say that the Book of Mormon were to now be rewritten, in many instances it would materially differ from the present translation." I believe this is truer today than it was at the end of the 19th century, and I believe that a more nuanced understanding of translation as a process can help us understand how to place Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon as a translation of an ancient text. Thank you. Hope I didn't kill your schedule for the rest of the day. Do the original papers exist with the signatures of the 3 and 8 witnesses along with the statement? I have to be honest, I have no idea. If I had a computer and Google, I could probably answer that question very quickly. With the Isaiah chapters, do you think he was looking at the gold plates or at the seer stone and seeing the 16th century King James Bible English exactly, or do you think that he was reading from the King James Bible directly? I don't think he was reading from the King James Bible directly. If I had to place myself on this spectrum of tight and loose, I would say that I am a fan of a tight translation. I believe that Joseph Smith was a reader of the text, and I believe that he was seeing the language that in the Isaiah that was more or less coming straight from the Isaiah text in the King James Bible. But I also believe that that language was put there specifically because he was the audience, he was the reader. And so for him to recognize these texts, these passages from the Old Testament, and with Isaiah it's a lot easier because there's so much of it. In many other places it's a little less easy. When Jacob chapter 1 quotes Psalm 95, if it had been substantially different, we might not really recognize that he's quoting from Psalm 95 if it hadn't used this King James language. And so I think that that he sees the King James language that is part of this translation process, but it's aimed at helping him understand what he's reading as much as it helps us understand what we're reading. In the loose control theory, how are things such as 15th century English Hebrewisms and ancient names explained? I think that in the loose control theory, we get more of kind of a blend, right? He gets something given to him, and I think that many times he regurgitates it to some extent in the way that he receives it, right? And in other ways, he manages to relate it to his own experience. One of the things about ancient names in particular is that I suspect that he has very little understanding of the names and the places that he's talking about, and so that tends to come through much more literally. There's less of him involved in a translation process in a loose control theory. That some of that is given to that second communicative act in what he receives. And he doesn't turn around and relate that to his own experience and spit out something that makes a lot more sense to us in our time frame. Could there not be a combination of the two models? Oh, sure. And Royal Skousen noted that in his essay, right? That we're really looking at two ends of a spectrum and that there's a lot of room in between. I think, though, that part of our struggle is that when we talk about a loose model and a tight model, we're really talking about this idea of what we see when we look at it. And we're talking about these descriptions that are produced. And I think that some of these descriptions that we have been influenced by other discussions. And so we're not just talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon, especially when we start reading these accounts that are written in the 1880s and 1890s. They're participating, as I noted earlier, in that larger discussion about what a perfect translation should look like. And so they're trying to describe the translation of the Book of Mormon in ways that they feel represent a perfect translation. That's their emphasis. I'm sorry that I'm going to have a hard time reading this next section. These commandments are of me and were given unto my, this is a D&C quote, I'm assuming, right? 124. In their weakness after the manner of their language, which what seems to be tight control is the Lord communicating through Joseph imperfectly in his language. I think that when we talk about this, we also have to be just a little bit careful, right, in the sense that the Doctrine and Covenants is the same sort of process potentially as we talk about in the Book of Mormon, right? We aren't going to hold one up to one standard and the other up to a different standard. And I don't think we want to use one as a proof text for necessarily defining how the other one occurs. I think that every language is imperfect. I think there's something I've been contemplating the last little bit, there's a certain irony in the idea that they were trying to create this Adamic language at various times, right? Partly to fulfill that prophecy in Zephaniah about a pure language and a language that was going to be the language of the whole world and everybody in it. And in a funny way, English, the language that the Book of Mormon is translated into, which really only became the dominant language at the end of the 19th century, has become the closest we've ever had to a universal language. Despite its imperfections and its problems, it seems to work pretty well. And the final question, any comments how Joseph Smith brought forth the Book of Abraham? I think personally that the Book of Abraham is a bit of a challenge for us. Going out on a bit of a limb here, we have Revelation as part of the Book of Mormon, and we also have commentary of Joseph Smith. And so I think that there are large chunks of text in the Book of Abraham that Joseph Smith is writing in there. And so in that sort of sense, I tend to view it as perhaps even more this idea of Joseph Smith as a translator in the full sense that he's taking these ideas that he gets and he's converting them into a message that's relevant to the saints at the time and to an extent to us today. But I don't really see Joseph as a translator in this case in being able to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, or that the text that he produces is going to align itself in a word for word, character for character sort of way with the text that we have on the papyrus fragments, at least those that we still have and those that he copied down. That's it. Thank you.